All right, well, thank you all for coming out to rainy/snowy Bozeman. It's really a pleasure to have this quantity of French historians in the Mountain West and Bozeman, our little cow town. It's really fabulous. I've really enjoyed meeting many of you and seeing some familiar faces as well. And so I'd like to begin today by acknowledging with honor and respect the indigenous nations on whose traditional territories the city of Bozeman now stands and whose historical relationships with the land continues until this day. We also acknowledge the elders past and present, including Montana State University's current Council of Elders. The Valley of the Flowers, which is the original indigenous name for the Gallatin Valley, has been and remains a place of learning for Native American peoples who for millennia have passed ways of knowing, being, and doing from one generation to the next. So it is now my pleasure to introduce Caroline Ford, professor and Peter Reel Chair of European History at the University of California at Los Angeles, my home state. Dr. Ford is the author of numerous influential books in French history, including Creating the Nation in Provincial France, Religion and Political Identity in Brittany, and Divided Houses, Religion and Gender in Modern France. In 2016, she published Natural Interests, The Contest Over Environment in Modern France, a book that was recently translated into French. And for historians of the environment who use France as their laboratory, Caroline Ford's book is an essential work. It is a book that beautifully interweaves the core questions driving modern French political and cultural history with questions of environmental thinking and environmental stewardship. It is a model piece of scholarship for the next generation of historians working on the entanglements between environment and society in modern Europe. Today, Dr. Ford will be speaking on the topic of land use and historical landscape protection in France's Gascony region. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Ford.
Well, thank you, Catherine, for that very kind and generous introduction. And I want to begin by saying that Catherine contacted me about giving a keynote on essentially the theme of the Western Society's Conference on the Environment. And she asked me to talk about ecological or environmental approaches to Francophone history, or at least the contribution of environmental history to a larger history of France and also France's empire. And I thought about this, and I decided that instead of giving a kind of broad, general, synthetic lecture, to talk about research that I'm actively engaged in at the moment. And I spent a couple of months in Bordeaux this past spring and summer, which illustrates a kind of environmental approach to larger questions in French history, and which involves the history of the transformation of landscapes, the transformation of rural economies over a broad span of time from the 18th century to the 20th century, the relationship between the natural and man-made landscapes, and how this history relates to what was going on in France's colonial empire, which is a direction, I think, with the work of Diana Davis and others, that many environmental historians of France have been moving in. And I'm going to be doing this within the context of a very specific region in southwestern France. I've called it Gascony, which does not exist. It refers to actually a region, Gascony, that existed prior to the French Revolution, and then after the French Revolution, of course, with the administrative reorganization of France, it's the departments of the Gironde and the Landes. So that's really my laboratory here. And I'm also dealing with the question of actually what started out as a deforested landscape. Historians of France, environmental historians, have for some time now explored the history of forested landscapes, the long struggle over forests as a natural resource in France, the extent of deforestation, and the impact of state policy and local land practices, land use practices. In Gascony, which is the focus really of my talk today, or this broad region, forests and trees were central concerns before, during, and after the French Revolution on the part of state officials and local landowners for a very specific reason, because by and large they were absent. These groups were concerned about desert wastes in the region and what to do about them in an area where woodland had long been sparse. This region of southwestern France contained really 2 million hectares, a sort of triangular, if you look at it, large tract of uncultivated land, referred to as the Landes, between the Garonne and Gironde rivers to the north and the Adour River to the south and the Atlantic Ocean to the west. And this is actually a kind of a print from 1779 by the Baron Charlevoix de Villiers of the general region. It doesn't include all of it, but it at least gives you a kind of sense of what the coastal area is with the rivers, and also shows you the kind of numerous lakes that you can find there. So you have this coastal region and then a second zone, a vast, flat landscape that was covered with low-lying brush, heath, and pine trees, dotted with several, as I've said, large lakes where herds of sheep had grazed since time immemorial. And just to give you a sense also of the sandy soil of the Landes, this is an aerial view where, this is obviously a contemporary photo. It didn't look like that in the 18th century for reasons that you will see, where there are big dunes. And these big dunes were constantly in the 18th century and before shifting around. That was part of the issue that was being addressed here. So to give you a sense of how this area was seen, none other than Voltaire, in his Dictionnaire philosophique, characterized the Landes as, quote, the desert of Sinai, between the Pays of Bayonne and Bordeaux. His appraisal was echoed by a local notable from the region in the Cahiers de Doléances of 1789 from the parish of La Benne. 20 years later, he wrote that the parish was, quote, a non-arable, barren territory, almost like Arabia, unquote. Little had changed in public perceptions by the 19th century. Bory de Saint-Vincent, who was a naturalist, who had taken refuge in the region with his family during the French Revolution, observed in the 1820s that, quote, the surface of the Grande Lande is subject to mirages, which are no less in their effects than the deserts of Egypt and Arabia. Indeed, by 1840, Théophile Gautier, the poet, wrote a poem about the region called Les Pins des Landes, and he called it, quote, a true French Sahara powdered with white sand. This sort of gives you the inner region, what that looked like. This is a photo I took in May of this year. And this is the sort of stanza from the Gautier poem. As you can see, the second line, the Sahara Français, and I'll talk about the last two lines towards the end of my talk. A century later, on the eve of the Second World War, the regionalist writer Maxime Leroy acknowledged the Landes' benighted reputation in a special issue of the Journal of All Things Urbanisme by stressing that in, quote, the aesthetic history of landscapes, the Landes had only occupied a significant place since the turn of the century. As, quote, an image of desolation, it had until then only inspired, in his words, pity, almost horror, among observers who ventured across its plain in the past and in the present, where, quote, a miserable, haggard, and feverish population prone to pellagra, a disease caused by mineral and vitamin deficiencies, eked out a meager existence. Leroy contrasted this image of desolation with the lawn that he, by contrast, celebrated in 1937 as, quote, a pure landscape, perhaps one of the few places in France that is only a landscape, and one in which he prized precisely for its wildness. For him, its singular beauty was the result of the way in which the immense silent forests complemented the placid lakes, whose grandiose wildness magnificently evoked, quote, a primordial past. For him, and this is his language, the soft sky of the southwest, the untamed ocean of Gascony, the region of the forest inspired to dream of a mysterious continent which mankind had not yet come to possess, and which could only be a source of admiration and not of awe or terror. The Lawn's obvious transformation in the minds of those who had observed it from the 18th century to the 20th century, from a desert waste to a cradle of untamed nature, were projects initiated by the French state and individual property owners to plant maritime pines, which resulted in the creation of vast new forests in the region. This transformation occurred in two phases between the 18th and the 20th centuries. The first involved the planting of pines at the edge of Gascony's coastal dunes during the French Revolution, just before and then during the French Revolution and Napoleonic periods, to prevent this kind of drift of sand from engulfing agricultural land. And indeed, these dunes actually engulfed whole farms, stopped up rivers, and so this was actually, a real threat and phenomenon. The second phase was launched during the Second Empire, so after 1848, roughly in the late 1850s, when the French state and private property owners planted maritime pines on an unprecedented scale in the lawn's interior for the purpose of agriculture and silvicultural development, which was justified in terms of mise en valeur. While this transformation did not go unnoticed by local observers, and has not gone unnoticed, obviously, by historians, studies of the phenomenon have primarily focused on its economic aspects. And there's been little attention given to a third moment following the Second World War during the Trente Glorieuses after World War II, when the forest of the Landes was designated as part of the nation's natural patrimoine, with the creation of the Parc Naturel Régional des Landes de Gascogne, that's what it's called, even though Gascony doesn't really exist, in 1970. And so there you have a map where you roughly have where it's demarcated, the kind of boundaries or the parameters of the park. And it's quite interesting that soon after that, one of France's first eco-museums was created in the region, in the commune of Sabre, the Eco-Musée de Marquez. So that's sort of a third moment. And so what this presentation explores is the process by which the devalorized landscape of the Landes came to be revalorized, how the process reflected similar processes that were taking place in France's overseas empire, and the larger consequences of this revalorization, which was largely effected through a policy of mise en valeur, especially during the 19th century, for the region's rural economy and pastoral populations from the French Revolution to the 20th century. And, sorry, I'm missing something. I'll get back to that. And so that's really what I want to chart here, the story of the transformation of the Landes, which really begins with the writings and the work of several men toward the end of the 18th century. But the name most frequently cited is that of Nicolas Théodore Brémontier, an engineer who trained at the prestigious École des Ponts et Chaussées, who is frequently credited for single-handedly arresting the sand drift of Gascony's coastal dunes by planting them with maritime pines. He is associated with the revolutionary project of planting 200 kilometers of coastal wetlands with the aromatic and resinous Pinus pipistrata in order to turn the salted waters of the Landes into productive timber-bearing and agricultural land. Brémontier came to be known as the Père des Dunes for techniques he used to build up the dunes in the region, such as the now famous, it's a big tourist site now, these are the kind of local inhabitants, the pastoral population, and I'm going to be talking about them. They have a particular look to them. They're on stilts, and I'll explain why. And this is my photo, actually, of the Dune de Pilar, but you can't really get a clear sense of it except, through these sort of aerial pictures. Essentially, this dune, which formed between the ocean and the land, was stopped by these kinds of barriers that he built up or helped to build up. Before his time, miles and miles of sodden salt pastures supported this local population, this community of marsh farmers and shepherds who made their way across the squelchy fields on stilts, particularly in the winter when it was wet. Brémontier came to Bordeaux in 1784 as the chief engineer in the service of the Ponts et Chaussées, turning his attention soon to the bleak coastal landscapes of the Landes, and particularly to the problem of the shifting dunes. After having consulted the work of Abbé Louis Mathieu Davy, who has received very little attention, and basically Brémontier gave him very little credit. He was born in Saint-Julien and was a native of the Landes, and presented the first work on the planting of pines as a solution to the problem of shifting dunes to the Academy of Bordeaux in 1774, for which he was awarded a prize entitled Research on the Origin of Sand on Our Coastal Regions and their dreadful incursions to the interior of the land and the means to fix it, essentially, is the title of the work, and it was published 2 years later in 1776. Influenced by this important work, Brémontier obtained the funds necessary to plant maritime pines on a significant scale on the dunes of La Teste in 1787, a project that was executed on the property of a seigneur of Rouen between 1788 and 1793. Not the kind of project you would expect people would be engaged in during the beginning of the French Revolution. The work was, however, interrupted in 1793, but it continued in fits and starts, largely with the help of a local entrepreneur who often paid workers out of his pocket. So it wasn't just a kind of a state initiative. Brémontier finally published his report on the whole project in 1796 as Mémoire sur les dunes, and in this particular region that he focuses on. And he proposed erecting fences and underbrush to protect the plantation of the young maritime pines to prevent the shift in the dunes. He used a mix of gorse and broom, and I won't get into all the technical details, and specifically the use of marram grass. And this mat-like root system of marram grass spread through the dunes like a powerful glue that held all of this in place. Brémontier's success at La Teste prompted him to expand the project, which was renewed during the Napoleonic episode, In July of 1801, an order was issued to continue planting pines on the entire coast of Gascony, and a commission composed of Blammo Ta and as chief engineer and the local notables presided over it. In July of 1808, a commission for the plantation of dunes was established also in the Department of Landes, which had been created in the French Revolution. And on the 14th of December 1810, a Napoleonic decree provided for the planting of pines in all of France's maritime departments where they were needed. These early initiatives were not abandoned during the Restoration, as evidenced in royal ordinances regarding the planting of dunes in 1817. And the prefect of the Gironde in the Restoration monarchy actually had this monument created in the honor of Blammo Ta in the region, which this is a postcard from the turn of the century. In his Man and Nature, or Physical Geography as Modified by Human Action, the American conservationist George Perkins Marsh devoted an entire chapter to sand and sand dunes. He summed up the condition of the land, which was very central to that chapter, in the following way, quote, "The destruction of coast towns and harbors which furnish markets for the produce of the plains, the damming up of rivers and the obstruction of smaller channels of natural drainage by the advance of the dunes were no doubt very influential causes for the region's wasteland." And if we add the drifting of sea sand over the soil, we have at least a partial explanation of the decayed agriculture and diminished population of this great waste. And of course, those of you who know, Man and Nature was written towards the latter third of the 19th century. He noted that the operations for fixing and reclaiming the dunes of Western France, which began under Blammo Ta about the same time as those in Denmark, had been conducted on a far larger scale and with greater success than in any other country in the world. And actually it served as a model in other places later, and also in places as far away much later on, like Western India and also in Australia. He attributed the success in part to climate and in part to the greater investment that the French state made in the project. The area of the dunes that had been secured from drifting sand by Blammo Ta and his successors was approximately 100,000 acres by the 1850s. The planting of maritime pines on the dunes of Gascony generated an extensive literature during the course of the 19th century in France and elsewhere, I should say. Blammo Ta's memoir was followed by François Gillet de Laumant's report on the memoirs of Blammo Ta of 1806, Amédée Boitel's The Maritime Pine, Its Culture in the Dunes, in 1848, and a host of articles were published in the Annales des Ponts et Chaussées and the Annales Forestières. It also attracted the attention of foreign observers, such as the Scotsman John Crombie Brown, honorary president of the African Institute in Paris, who became a botanist deeply interested in forestry in the Cape Colony, but wrote quite a lot about France, and who published pine plantations on the sand wastes of France in Edinburgh in 1878. Now, while the planting of pines on the coastal dunes of the Land of Gascony was largely complete by the Revolution, much of the Land's interior, or its second zone, as I mentioned at the beginning, remained unchanged and tied to a pastoral economy. In 1859, an English traveler, Charles Richard Weld, wrote that after leaving Bordeaux's rich agricultural hinterland, the heart of the wine production, with its verdant vineyards, and entering the Land, that, quote, "nothing can be more dreary than these apparently interminable wastes." The land of the departments of the Gironde and Landes, which were created during the French Revolution, consisted in the 19th century of 600,000 hectares, or 1,482,000 acres of wasteland, or so-called the désert du Midi. A few few years later, in 1862, the French geographer Élisée Reclus, who was himself born in the Gironde, described how, on leaving Bordeaux, the traveler almost immediately found himself in, quote, a plain without visible boundaries and covered with wild plants to the extreme horizon. George Perkins Marsh described the land of Gascony as, quote, the most remarkable sand plain of France, noting that it was excessively dry in the summer and flooded in the winter, providing pasturage for a few half-starved flock of sheep. Reclus noted that one could travel for whole days before coming upon, quote, a miserable hut, inhabited perhaps by some benighted souls, trembling with fevers. Such for him was the resemblance of the French land to the deserts of the Orient. The land's silent and barren interior landscape was transformed, just as Gascony's coastline had been in the late 18th century, by the planting of maritime pines during the Second Empire. This time, not for the purposes of fixing dunes and preventing sand drift, which threatened agricultural exploitation, it was conceived of in terms of getting rid of the terre inculte, or uncultivated pastoral land of the region's interior, in order to transform its entire economy in the name of mise en valeur. It must be said that these efforts were akin to those that were undertaken concurrently in France's overseas empire, notably in Algeria, which I've worked on in another context, where a settler population was expropriated vast tracts of land for agriculture or silvicultural purposes, and a colonial administration faced pastoral groups and populations which they regarded in ways that were similar to those of state officials and property owners undertaking similar projects in the land. Indeed, during the Ancien Regime, the land, or the landesco, and I showed you that one kind of drawing at the beginning, were routinely described as savages. And this stereotype persisted in the 19th century. And particular savages, I mean, in many parts of France, the population was regarded as savages, but in this particular region, I'll get into this, they had an identity. This was evident in a popular vaudeville play that opened on the 21st of October of 1811 in the Théâtre de Variété in Paris, entitled Les Habitants des Landes. And it was very popular, and in fact this edition that I have from the Bibliothèque Nationale is a new edition of 1817. The play's main protagonist, a servant by the name of Tremblin, accompanies his master, and these are some of the lithographs from that, into the wilds of the Landes, where he meets Clarenne. Of course, they have to have a romantic kind of love story here, the daughter of a sharecropper. The characters even include, if you see in the background where you see Tremblin, an African, perhaps a passing reference to the region's slave trade, I don't know. And then you have Clarine on the other side, and in the background you have the Landais or the Landesco on their sort of stilts. In scene 11, the main character, Tremblin, finds himself alone and sitting on a suitcase, exclaiming, quote, "What deserts must be far from France, because it's so different from the Touraine where I was born." He starts reading a book which is called Voyage in the Land of the Hottentots, Africa. He notes in his reading that the Hottentots are unusually tall, and at this moment two Landais then entered the stage on elevated stilts, or échasses as they come to be called. Clothed in sheepskins, the Landais or Landesco could most often be found tending their flocks while mounted on these tall stilts, which had been traditionally employed to navigate the barren and marshy wastes around them. They're represented in many, many drawings and paintings in the 19th century, and finally in photography. And I just want to show you a few. This is one from 1830 by Gintrac. And what's interesting about this is that actually, anthropologists, there are a number of anthropologists who work on these pastoral groups in the region, actually say that women were never on the stilts, that it was only men. I haven't gotten a good explanation of this, but nonetheless it's in most paintings and even in photography, but I'll just mention that as a footnote. And then this is by the naturalist writer Arthur Mangin, Le Désert et le Monde Sauvage, which I'll be talking about a little more, of 1866, and this is one of his prints also from the region. And then towards the very end of the 19th century, this is a figure actually in the Musée d'Aquitaine, they have his entire collection of stills. This is a local figure who really documented the last days of these pastoral groups in these photographs. And this is Berger et Chassier, circa 1890. I think I have another one here. Yes, this is another one. Just to give you a sense of what this looked like and what the Berger were. Tremblay in this play sees that their huts resemble those which he refers to as Canadians, which I think he means is meant North Americans. Putting the book aside, he draws a connection between what he is reading and what he sees around him, exclaiming, quote, "I am in Africa." The Landesco were also referred to in this particular play as Hurons, Asiatics, and Papuans. So Hottentots, everything is thrown into the mix, a kind of ultimate othering, if you will. In the words of another observer, again from this same period, quote, "Their shameless barbarity in the heart of France, near the birthplace of Montesquieu and Montaigne," who of course come from there. In 1837, François Vattard-Joannet, in his Statistiques du département de la Gironde, called the Landesco, quote, "the Arab of the Aquitaine," and asserted that the Landesco has something of the Arab in his physical and moral sense. In 1859, Henri Ribadou described the Landais as, quote, "Arabs or Indians of our land, whose only home was, quote, the great sandy desert, the Sahara of France." And I give you these various examples because I'm not making it up. It's very, very pervasive in all of the texts of this period. It's precisely in these kinds of pastoral groups that the colonial administrations and European settlers faced in France's overseas empire, not in the same form, and who they viewed as obstacles to agricultural and silvicultural development. In 1846, for example, the Algerian colonial administration began to grant long-term leases or concessions of forested land to wealthy French entrepreneurs who wished to develop land that was lucrative because of the presence of Aleppo pines and cork trees growing there. With the help of forest officials, they effectively barred indigenous pastoral populations from their traditional use of the land, which included livestock grazing and periodic brush fires. By the 1850s, a similar process of displacement occurred in the Landes. Engineers, businessmen influenced by Saint-Simonian ideas, local property owners, and the emperor himself, Napoleon III, saw new economic opportunities for the Landes' interior desert waste. Napoleon III actually purchased property in the region, and he renamed the commune in which he purchased it Solferino after his victorious battle. For entrepreneurs, landowners, and the French state, the vast uncultivated spaces used by these pastoral populations cried out for agricultural development, guided by a policy of mise en valeur. The Saint-Simonians, and also we can think of, let's say, the Pereire brothers, who were very important and influential, who were actually originally Portuguese and who spent their childhood actually in Bordeaux, were in on the act as well, and they actually developed the Arcachon, helped to develop it as a resort town and develop rail lines to cart timber and other products out of the region. More importantly, a number of property owners and entrepreneurs put their full weight behind the planting of new forest in the Landes. Two polytechniciens, Pierre Cazot and François-Jules Cambrelan were important in this regard. Cazot became Inspector of Agriculture in 1852, and Cambrelan initiated a project to drain the marshes of the Landes and to plant vast stretches of the region with maritime pines, which was followed by the law of 19 June 1857, the loi sur l'assainissement et la mise en valeur, mise en culture des Landes de Gascony, which provided for the confiscation of vast tracts of communal land and its sale to local buyers, and those even not from the region. The 1857 law marked a turning point in the history of the Landes and the Landes landscape, striking a death knell for the traditional pastoral economy of the region, which, while laying the groundwork for the industrial production of resin, which was later used, polymer glues, in industrial production, and which became particularly lucrative during the American Civil War. While the effort to plant the allegedly empty spaces of the Landes with maritime pines was largely successful, it engendered responses that were similar to those among pastoral populations in Algeria, who were displaced by the exploitation of North Africa's cork forests in the last quarter of the 19th century. Statistics suggest that there was significant increase in the number of forest fires in the departments of the Landes and the Gironde, and more particularly on communal land planted after 1857. The sharp increase in the number of forest fires in the department of the Landes after the passage of the law led to the creation of a commission to study the problem, and a report was produced by Henri Faré, the Director General of the Forest Administration, which attested to the severity of the problem. Annex 10 of the report constituted a table of all forest fires, and I'm sorry, the quality of this is the actual report. And sorry, but it is blurred, but I will sort of summarize here what it tells you. It shows essentially Annex 10 constituted a table of all forest fires that occurred each year from 1858 to 1872, showing where the fires burned in areas with pines that were there before the 1850 law and after it. And it's very, very noticeable that where the fires burned was, where the new pines were planted, and not in other places. Numbers, I won't go into them in detail. In the Landes and in Algeria, forest fires emerged as a persistent problem, and the pastoral populations in both metropolitan and colonial North Africa were held responsible. In Algeria, a League for the Reforestation of Algeria was established in the 1880s, in which there's all kinds of discourse about the incendiary Arab. A government official who had a job with the Forest Service added that it is above all we Europeans who claim to bring civilization here, which was part of, putting mise en culture or mise en valeur, and who should take charge of the cause of the forest. Similarly, a property owner by the name of Tessier from Lacanau, a coastal commune in the Gironde, wrote in an 1873 pamphlet entitled Enquête sur les incendies dans les Landes that 200,000 hectares of communal land that had been used for pasture and sold as a result of the 1857 law and had provided the land for extensive plantation of pines, had really been burned almost entirely by, quote, an ignorant population lost in its solitude, which did not see it as, in his words, progress. According to Tessier, quote, they saw themselves as being dispossessed by foreigners, and some resorted to arson. Faré and his commission took 49 depositions exclusively from prominent landowners, elected officials, and government administrators, essentially. Many observed that most of the fires occurred on what was formerly communal land that had been sold and that had been planted with pine in the previous 20 years. Others affirmed that most of the fires were as a result of malveillance on the part of the pastoral population. Still others who saw the fires as a result of existing antagonism between pastoral and silvicultural interest. And there were some who had some sympathy for the plight of the shepherd and suggested that the law of 1857 be suspended. In a presentation before the French Association for the Advancement of Sciences in Bordeaux, Alexandre Léon summarized the situation in the law, saying that the law of 1857 represented a frontal attack on the pastoral economy. He said that without needing to go into details, quote, suffice it to say that more than 30,000 hectares of young forest burned between 1868 and 1869. After a successful pacification, and he uses the term pacification, he claimed that the shepherds seemed to understand finally that there could be some way to reconcile the pastoral economy and the silvicultural economy. In the Landes, the battle for civilization was ultimately won by the state and individual property owners. The shepherd and the échassier became quaint figures of the past, and his children were transformed into, actually there are two terms for them, or there were two terms at the time, gemeur and résigné. Actually there were two separate functions and they kind of fused together. And this is Alnodin's picture, and actually women were engaged in this, which is essentially bleeding the trees, and that was what the second part of the Gautier, he's talking about the wounds in the trees. So it transformed the economy in very significant ways. The economy and the landscape of the Landes underwent then a dramatic transformation from the French Revolution to the Second Empire, but it was precisely in the 1860s that the desert landscape of the Landes ironically came to be revalorized in the French environmental imagination. In 1866, the popular science and nature writer, I referred to Arthur Mangin, published Le Désert et le Monde Sauvage, in which he celebrated the deserts as places where nature, quote, maintains its inviolability from encroachments of human actions, unquote, when it was in fact exactly the opposite. While much of the book was devoted to deserts in other parts of the world, he argued that the presence of the Landes and its forests demonstrated that the French could have a taste of the deserts and a primordial forest without leaving France, and they left a profound impression on him. He ironically contrasted the pines of the Landes with another forest where pines were being planted or replanted, and they weren't indigenous maritime pines, but they were Baltic pines, by foresters in order to revitalize an older forest. That was the forest of Fontainebleau, which I talked about actually in my book. While the pine plantations were applauded by the foresters and the forest administration, the Barbizon school of painters who flocked there from the 1840s to the 1860s, and who were largely responsible for parts of the forest being designated as France's first protected natural site in 1861, derided those pines as foreign vegetation, which gave Fontainebleau, in their words, a soulless aspect more fitting of the Russian steppes. Mangin also, so pines, could have different meanings in different regions, and also depending on what kinds of pines they are. Mangin also spoke contemptuously of Fontainebleau because it lacked the wild aspect of the Landes, and also because it had been not planted with indigenous pine. It was this alleged wildness that Mangin and Leroy ultimately celebrated in 1937, and which by the 1960s became one of the chief justifications for the creation of the Natural Regional Park by the decree of 16th October 1970 in order to protect a rich but nonetheless vulnerable natural site with the mission of preserving the nation's natural patrimoine. The desert of the Landes was then first transformed through Brémontier's project to fix the coastal dunes. It was then planted with pines on an immense scale in the region's interior for the purposes of agricultural and silvicultural production, again being protected as an important part of France's natural heritage. This transformation shows the ways in which the landscape became implicated in larger debates about social change, economic progress in terms of mise en valeur, and environmental protection, whether it took the form of conservation or landscape preservation. Moreover, the often triumphalist discourse of state engineers, local entrepreneurs, and later environmentalists hid the consequences of the changes in the land that they sought to protect for the region's pastoral population, in much the same way that the populations in North Africa and the indigenous populations of America could be written out of the landscape of the West, as the American environmental historian Bill Cronin has argued in an important article entitled "The Trouble with Wilderness, or Getting Back to the Wrong Nature." And one of the great ironies of the history of the Landes was that the region's landscape was in many ways an artificial creation that was the work of engineers and foresters beginning in the 18th century. The Landes, by the mid-20th century, had come full circle, now attracting the likes of Charlie Chaplin, who spent a lot of time on the coast, Coco Chanel in the 1920s, and Winston Churchill, who spent many summers in Mimizan on Gascony's coast, where he first began to develop his, that's the goatee, I just had to put that up in order to have the second two lines about the wounds in the trees. That wouldn't have been the case really in the 1830s and 40s. That's Le Désert et le Monde Sauvage. We get to Winston Churchill and his paintings. This is where he sort of developed his painting skills. And then to end in 1995, President François Mitterrand called French forests, including those of the Landes, integral parts of, quote, our collective patrimoine, in an introduction to a colloquium entitled La Forêt, les savoirs et le citoyen. But the 18th century shepherd's cottage, which Mitterrand purchased in 1965 in the commune of Lach in the department of the Landes, bore witness to the region's longer history and to the memory of its pastoral past. Thank you.
So we have time for a few minutes of Q&A, if you're all right with that. So I think we have the microphone back there. Did it disappear? Oh, it is right in front of me. So we can just go ahead and pass this around. If anyone would like to raise their hand.
So I had the great fortune of hearing this talk, a version of it earlier this summer. And it's
Yeah, but both of us were actually in Australia for an event honoring Peter McPhee, who was here honoring John Merriman, and I gave a shortened version of it.
Yeah, it's actually even better the second time around, apparently, so thank you. And I was struck by a quote that you made earlier in the paper, in which you referred, I can't recall who you were quoting actually, if it was Blammo Ta or somebody else, but the author of the quote said something like, the desert waste was untamed nature and only a landscape. And I wondered if you could elaborate on that, because in the course of this talk, where you talk about the kind of ebb and flow of this very heavily kind of transformed landscape as being naturalized in the imagination and sort of renaturalized through trees. I was wondering to the extent that landscapes are interpreted as being without people, because in France, the Parcs Naturels Régionaux are actually designated as sites worthy of preservation in large part because of their being places with nature and people in coexistence that have been very much developed in tandem over millennia. So.
Yeah, and in fact, I went to this Eco Musée this past spring, and you're absolutely right, because they have the sort of nature part of it, but they also have a sort of replicated village. You know, what it looked like, sort of at the end of the 19th century. That is true, and you have the two things going on side by side, and there is a sort of much more than in the United States, as you know. I mean, Cronin's writing in a very different kind of context, sort of recognition of a peopled landscape, not only in France but in Europe more generally. I think you could say, as opposed to here. That's true. But you still, and the person I was actually quoting from was Leroy and Mangin. And Mangin, in a way, writing in the 1860s, was the forerunner of Leroy. You had the beginnings of a sort of discourse in France among some, I think it was a minority, where they saw that in certain parts of France there were unpeopled landscapes. Of course, it's debatable, but you're absolutely right that there is a tradition of sort of preserving, protecting the peopled landscape, not just sort of virgin nature, which is. I mean, I participated. Actually, it was very funny in something at the German Historical Institute on parks and global perspective, national parks, and people talked about different traditions and thinking about them. And the American tradition is very different from the European. It came out as being very clear. So you're right, yes, and it's true in that very Eco Musée. Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much. That was really fascinating. I was particularly struck by the desert analogy, because where I've come across the connections between Algeria is with the question of wetlands and drainage. And so the sort of you heard a little bit about the wetlands.
Yeah, well, it's also very curious, because when you're talking about the desert of the Landes, I mean, if you go to the Landes in the winter, it looks very different from going there in the summer. I mean, it's just completely parched, incredibly hot, very dry, and in the winter it's almost completely different. So, in a way, it's a strange. I mean, you could extend the meaning of the word desert as just being empty, sort of an emptiness in a sense. So when these authors are, I mean, it is curious to talk about the comparing it to the Sahara, because it doesn't take into account the sort of the wetland aspect of it, which is clearly a part of the Landes. Perhaps it's something having to do really with the coastal dunes. I mean, that particular part of the Landes, because there are, in a way, sub-regions of the Landes. It's very, very sandy, it's true, but it's not the same everywhere. The coastal part of it is quite different from the area that was targeted in the 1860s. And what they were doing there was, a lot of it was drainage, not just planting. I didn't really get into the drainage aspect of it, but not just the planting of pines, which are amenable to that kind of soil, but also draining all of this. So you don't need those people on stilts anymore.
Thank you so much. I just found this really fascinating. I have two references that I want to make sure you know about. So the François Mauriac-Thérèse d'Esquipou novel, which is set in the Landes, and the main character is this unfortunate woman whose husband is made a fortune off the pines, and the pines around them are burning. The there was a film adaptation of Both with That Too a couple of years ago.
Oh, okay. Well, can you give me the reference after?
Yeah. And then the second one is that I have a colleague who's an art historian who was just hired at Cornell, and she's writing about landscape and history of France, and she has a chapter on the blonde.
Oh, okay.
Those Arnold down photos.
Oh, okay.
Among other things, and they're not. I mean, what's interesting is that they're not actually great representations. They're kind of reconstructions that he's doing. What the launch should look like, which is kind of amazing. So yes, I think that you should definitely watch this.
Yes. Oh, well, that's wonderful. I'm glad. This is what's wonderful about, kind of learning about what other people are doing. I didn't know that she was doing that. There's been a lot of interest in Félix Arnaudin. A couple of years ago in the Musée d'Aquitaine, they had a big exhibit. And actually, when I was there this summer, I went into the bowels of the kind of museum to look at many of the stills, which are not so well known. And I talked a long time to the conservator, the archivist, and she said that yes, actually, most of those, I didn't go into that. It wasn't like he went out and sort of was snapping pictures. He actually constructed those. I mean, almost as if he were a painter. And he was the one who put those women. And some people have actually interviewed the women that he chose to some time ago. So it's true that it's not kind of documentary evidence. In a way, what it also tells you about is kind of the photographer's nostalgia, if you will, what he's bringing to this, and he ended up himself. His mother was not very pleased about this, marrying one of essentially a domestic servant who came from this population, and this was very much frowned upon because he came from a sort of a relatively wealthy middle-class family, but I would love both of those references. Yeah, thank you. And what is your name?
I'm Catherine Clark.
Okay, great, thank you. Mm-hmm. Hello.
I am geographically challenged, so I might be talking about someplace totally different, and I know it's not alone, but I just wonder how far away it is. Which I'm just thinking about the Atlantic Ocean. And first, my question would be about, is the retreat of the sea?
Is there the retreat?
There's a sea retreat from the shore between 1650 and 1850, which is therefore creating new shoreline. The second is more political, because I have been teaching the 1848 revolution. And I was wondering whether the drainage that some people have mentioned was something. I mean, I know that the workers from the national workshops were sent to drain marshes, and that's one of the reasons they refused to go. And whether we have the same kind of political repercussions in the wetlands part of the land, or am I superbly out of the region that my question is relevant?
Yeah, well, the first question, I don't actually really know whether there, the information about whether the sea was retreating or the sea levels in terms of the coastal region. So. I don't know the answer to that. In terms of the second question, there's a sort of question of chronology. I mean, really going back to the 17th century, the state undertook projects of drainage. So this is not unique to the Landes. Maybe the scale of it is, the attention that was devoted to it, because actually Napoleon III was personally invested in all of this. a lot of the, I mean, this happened really in the 1860s, so we're long after 1848, and most of the labor would be coming from the regions. So I think the two things would have to be disassociated, is my sense. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
We have time for maybe one more question back there.
Hi, thank you very much for the paper. It was really, really interesting. My question is about like an article that Sahara published a couple of years ago on the idea that like, the French state used the colonies as an experiment for developing their hydraulic system. So I was wondering if you see something similar, or if the comparison between Algerian desert and the land is just purely metaphorical in a way, and or if there is like kind of a formal experiment there as well. And I also have a question about the chassiers.
Mm-hmm.
To what extent, so I'm sure they still exist, but to what extent also they are just, way part of the folklore that people kind of project and want to see and to. Do you have records of really those people still being in the chasse and not being modernized, or modernized is maybe not the right term, but like actually had like adopted method of agriculture that would be more modern than just like what they were doing on the
Yeah, I mean, basically, the échassiers, I mean, they sort of disappear by the early 20th century. I think, you have to say, I don't know, I mean, many of them actually got into the whole industry of the tree industry and just, changed professions in significant ways. You do have, I mean, for example, in the Musée d'Aquitaine, there has been some attempt to do oral histories, but it's not very extensive in any sense. So actually our knowledge is quite limited. But I don't think that there is a kind of a massive shift going into agriculture. There was also quite a bit of out-migration from the land in the early 20th century. But the whole sort of situation of, I mean, what you saw there of being on stilts and all that, I mean, that just disappeared entirely. Yeah. And your first question, just remind me about...
I was just wondering if Algeria, if they use Algeria as an experiment land.
No, I mean, I don't think that, that it's a question of one is experimented and then it's brought to France, or vice versa. I really see these things as being interconnected and happening at the same time. And I suppose when I got into this material, I was just particularly struck by all this Arabs of France and all of this kind of thing, and what was going on. I don't think it means that actual. I think it's a reflection of the sort of consciousness of practices that are taking place in the empire and in France, and it's in some ways an easy vocabulary to use, but I don't think it's something where something's tried out first and then it's imported or vice versa. They're happening in some senses concurrently, and if anything, even though the language of the Arab and so on, it goes back to the 18th century, this is happening first in metropolitan France, not in the colonies.
Great, so I think we'll have to leave it there for today,
Okay.
but please join me in thanking Caroline